Hello, this is Freda Brazle, and I will be presenting this in satisfaction for Project 1 for DMG 810 Research for Management Division. I will be conducting an evaluation of a servant leadership quantitative research article for Brookshire Industries. Good afternoon to the senior leadership team at Brookshire Industries, and once again, congratulations, May, on your appointment as CEO. We are excited about the direction that you are going to take us on and are very happy to support you on our path. Last meeting, you shared with us having read one study called Achieving High Organization Performance Through Servant Leadership, as well as your interest in shifting our organization to a culture of servant leadership to maintain high performance. As I am studying evidence-based approaches as well as quantitative research articles, I saw this as an opportunity for me to really understand the article that you had read, as well as to advocate for a well-rounded evidence-based approach to support your direction. I saw this as beneficial to having a higher success at moving forward. So what I did is the approach that I used, which is listed on the bottom half of slide 2, was I first looked at the case study that you had read and got good familiarity with it. And then I went ahead and researched other studies on servant leadership that are peer reviewed, and I actually found 1,161 articles within the University of Maryland library. I created a criteria which I used on some of those articles, and I identified one article that I thought was pretty good, and I pulled together some recommendations and conclusions that I'd like to share with you all. So if you sit tight with me, allow me to walk you through the work that I did. So I'm going to start out with defining what is servant leadership. Especially since there are so many different types of leadership out there, it is important for us to have a fundamental understanding around servant leadership. So according to greenlist.org, the father or founder of servant leadership who really articulated or formalized this was Robert K. Greenleaf. The ideas behind servant leadership at Ancient, but Robert was the person that really pulled together the formal understanding of servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf was born in 1904 during the Industrial Revolution. He was a math major, and he got a job with AT&T, which at that point in time was one of the largest organizations in the world. As he was working at AT&T, he realized that organizations that thrived had able leadership. They had leaders who acted more as supportive coaches and served both the needs of both employees and organizations. And he actually put together this saying that the organization exists for the person as much as the person exists for the organization, which was not popular at that point in time. Other academians came after Robert Greenleaf and have built on his definition, the likes of Jill Graham and Robert Linden. And what you see on slide 3 are what the definition of servant leadership has evolved to. It is a leadership style that really focuses in on satisfying employees' needs over leaders' own personal needs. It is one where employees are provided with tools as well as empowered to understand and play a role in actual customer satisfaction. It is one where they get the right support for their development needs, and the trust which the employees gain is one of working in the best interest of the organization. And there's a bigger focus on the outcomes, and they are better job attitudes as well as behaviors and performance, and which results in better team and organizational levels. So the definition has continued to evolve. However, fundamentally, it is one of service to your employees such that employees can then really help push the agenda and objectives of the organization. And this is according again to thegreenlist.org, as well as the articles that consistently reference Robert Greenleaf. Now that we have an understanding on what servant leadership is, I would like to share with you the roadmap and the criteria that I used in coming up and selecting an article that we could look at. As I mentioned, they were over 1,100 articles in the University of Maryland's library that were peer reviewed, and I went through the articles, some of the articles, using the roadmap that is shown here. What's important as you're looking at a article is understanding the purpose, the philosophy, its design, the variables that are being tested, and then you want to understand the external validity and internal validity of the procedures and measures, as well as be able to understand and make sense of the graphical displays, and really hone in on the findings as well as the conclusions of the article. So the roadmap and criteria that was used was consistent on all the articles that I decided to look at for purposes of this exercise. In reviewing the weightings for evaluating a quantitative research article, it is clear that the steps that are included do not weigh the same. They are some steps that are critical to driving the course and direction for some of the other steps. On this slide, in green, with the letter A, are those steps that are critical to understanding the direction for the article, and in B, in amber, these steps are very dependent on those steps that are in A. Using this criteria and methodology, we were able to apply against the subset of articles that were selected and able to identify an article in addition to the one that May had read that we could use for comparative purposes. Allow me now to share with you the results of having run this criteria on the journal article. Going through the selection process and criteria, the article that I chose to compare against the 2010 Achieving High Organization Performance through Servant Leadership was an article written in 2014 called Servant Leadership and Serving Culture, Influence on Individual and Unit Performance. On the left-hand side, you will find the authors listed. The author for Achieving High Organization Performance through Servant Leadership was written by Melcher and Bosco, and these authors' experience and academic areas of focus are around management, financial management, gender in organization, and workplace issues. The article that I selected, Servant Leadership and Serving Culture, Influence on Individual and Unit Performance, which is authored by 4 people, Lyndon, Wayne, Liao, and Mosa. Their experience cumulatively is organizational behavior, management, leadership, employee leader, employee organization, human resources, labor relations, identity, and identification. What you see on the right-hand side are really statistics on the number of references that these articles have. The histogram has in blue the 2010 article, so you see there are 46 article references compared to 89 references for servant leadership And the article references really point to the number of articles that support the work that was conducted by these two separate journal articles. On the right hand side of the bar chart, you see the sightings as per Google Scholar, and you'll see that the article Achieving High Organization Performance has been cited 97 times, whereas the 2014 article has been cited 133 times. And what you see in those arrows are the differences in the number of references as well as in the number of sightings. So from this page, you can see that the 2014 servant leadership and serving culture influence individual and unit performance has had not only more references to support it, but also has got many more sightings. So now we start doing the comparisons between the two articles, and they will be 5 pages. The layout on each slide is to the left. You'll see the criteria that we're using in assessing the journal articles, and on the right hand side you'll actually see extracts from each of the journal entries that pertain to the area that's under consideration. On this first page, which I weighted very heavily as this is the beginning of the direction of the testing that needs to be conducted, is the research purpose, the philosophy, and design. The research purpose, philosophy, and design for achieving high organization performance through servant leadership was somewhat ambiguous, and they had 4 different statements that talked to the work that was going to be addressed in the article. Notwithstanding, it was clear that they were going to use a Barbato and Wheeler survey, and that they were going to really manage the measures. They were going to measure their managers' measures around service leader characteristics, and they had identified 2 hypotheses that they were going to be testing. On the other hand, for the servant leadership and serving culture, influence on individual and unit performance, the article was very clear on their quest to identify how to emulate leaders' behaviors by prioritizing the needs of others. And they were also very clear on their model that was created that included 8 hypotheses, and these were going to build upon each other. So my assessment of one article versus the other was, one had a lot of information that made it a little bit more challenging to determine what the one true purpose was, whereas the other article was more clear on what and how it was going to include in its scope and in its purpose, as well as the philosophy behind that, and the design was thereafter created on that. That is the result of the first criteria evaluation for the 2 journal entries. The second criteria for evaluation for comparative analysis was on the variables, and both articles did a really good job of identifying the variables that were going to be used in the procedure and measures for the testing. As you can see on this page, age, highest level of education, organizational stewardship, emotional healing, persuasive mapping, wisdom, and altruistic calling were well defined within the article and were included. And on the servant leadership and serving culture influence on individual and unit performance, the clear variables were also very clearly defined, and they were separated into 2 sections, one on the store level for servant leadership, servant culture, and store performance, and then on the individual level for employee identification with store in-role performance, creativity, customer service behaviors, and turnover intentions. So both articles did a very good job in articulating the variables that were going to be tested. External validity and internal validity are also weighted very heavily in the criteria for looking at an article. And this is because you're really looking to understand the sample size, the composition of the sample, determining if there is sample bias, as well as if any errors, type 1 or type 2 errors, have been experienced. And you're also looking at internal validity of control threads and whether there's any options for researcher induced and where there's clarity on the part of the testing to the approach and purpose of the article, as well as replicability. As you can see from these two comparisons, they were pretty vast from not only the sample size, but also from the response rate, as well as from the testing. In in looking at the achieving high organization performance through servant leadership, it became clear that convenience sampling was used, which is always the easiest route to take, but also introduces a higher level of possibility that the sample results do not accurately reflect the population, which is very important to look out for as we are looking to extrapolate the results of a sample size. One can venture to say that the achieving high organization performance through servant leadership procedure and process was focused on only top luxury cars and was also focused only on mid-managers, and last but not least, the questionnaire that was used was not empirically tested. So whilst they had the appropriate testing from the sample, the question becomes whether those results accurately reflect the population. On the other hand, we saw much more defined clarity on the servant leadership and servant culture influence on individual and unit performance, where the definitions were very clear on what was being tested. There was also increased perspective from utilizing 5 different sources for information, from the employees, from the managers, from the customers, from the internal audits by headquarters, and external audits by consultants, which eliminates some of the bias around the sample, and as well as increases the likelihood of having true representation of the population. So looking comparatively at these two papers, it is clear that the servant leadership and serving culture influence on individual and unit performance was an alternate good paper and article that leadership can look at. Our fourth criteria is on the graphical displays and the findings, which both articles did a decent job of. The Achieving High Organization Performance had 5 tables to support the testing that the survey had conducted, and the test from the hypothesis proved that mid-level managers who report to servant leaders will exhibit above average levels of servant leader characteristics themselves, as well as there was no difference in the observations of servant leader characteristics, which were conducted using an ANOVA. What was interesting is whilst the findings were accurate compared to the testing, they is still a disconnect or a challenge between aligning the testing to the interpretation of increasing high organization performance from the testing that was performed. For the other article, Servant Leadership and Serving Culture Influence on Individual and Unit Performance, the article did not have as many tables, but really spent a lot of time really going through the relationships between servant leadership and serving culture. It actually had defined serving culture and introduced that as a additional intervention or a variable within the paper. And it also had really explicit information on how each of these variables worked together. So all in all, from a graphical display and findings perspective, both articles did a great job of showing what their particular tests were focused in on. Last but not least, for the criteria are the conclusions. And the conclusions are weighted very heavily. They are just as important as the research purpose. The conclusion really brings all the pieces together and demonstrates not only the advancement of the particular article based on prior research, but also opens up for future opportunities. It also really helps identify the limitations, and in this particular case, both articles listed their limitations, both articles listed the opportunities for subsequent contribution to the science. The achieving high organization performance through servant leadership was positing that there was an opportunity for extrapolating the results of the three top dealerships that were service industry into other areas, including full profit and service. Whilst the servant leadership and serving culture influence was really around the extension of the work for servant leadership theory. Both papers recognized that there is limited empirical evidence in servant leadership, and as a result, their work continues to build upon the information that exists within this area. So both conclusions were aligned with the work that they had done, and both demonstrated what could be done. I will now segue to the recommendations from the comparative analysis that can be taken for leadership. In summary, I would like to pull three recommendations for leadership teams. The first one is in identifying one case study as a reason to transition to servant leadership. I would like to recommend that we identify additional quantitative articles on servant leadership that will also include manufacturing, and let's pull together some common themes and opportunities that we can leverage as we begin our journey to shifting to a culture of servant leadership. The articles that I shared were from the service industry, so being able to tap and do more investigative work in manufacturing will be helpful and beneficial to us. The second recommendation is, as we're working through this, a common theme that I found was most of the survey results, as well as the subjects that were involved in these samples, were men. And we know that there is a difference between men and women from leadership style, as communicated in some of the journal articles. And what I'd like to do is just make sure that we're making provisions and making any adjustments for when we have a difference with gender. And third and last is as we determine the deployment plan to transitioning to a culture of servant leadership is being able to have enterprise-wide communication as well as employee engagement for the agreed upon path. So with that said, I thank you so much for your time and for your attention in hearing the research and study that I did on the uh, journal articles, and I appreciate any feedback that you might have. Thank you.